Excellencies, distinguished participants, friends and colleagues connecting to this online event from around the globe, good day to you. Welcome to this first of a series of high-level events organized in the context of the launch of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Why is this event the first of that series? Because its purpose is to lay the ground and set the scene for the decade by addressing the following questions. What is ecosystem restoration? And what does it take to have or to achieve high quality ecosystem restoration? My name is Luc Nyakaja, connecting from Cotonou, Benin. I'm the founder and president of a think and do tank named GPS Dev, an acronym for Governance and Policies for Sustainable Development. Our mission is to contribute to making governance system more conducive for sustainable development. I've served as Minister of Environment of my country, Benin, and as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD. It is in that latter capacity that I have laid the ground and successfully promoted during the Rio+20 summit in June 2012, the concept of land degradation neutrality that became SDG target 1503. This event features expert voices from the Decade's Science Task Force convened by IUCN as a pillar of the official implementation of the decade. The Science Task Force, or STF, will release later this year a foundational think piece with a baseline understanding for delivering high quality ecosystem restoration, from which all partners involved in the decade can build pathways of action. This document will be launched at the World Conservation Congress in early September this year after a peer review process. I have the privilege of chairing the Science Task Force as a facilitator of the work of this extraordinary team of 6 renowned scientists gathered here as panelists to share their insight with you about the subject of ecosystem restoration. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Angela Andrade in Colombia. Angela is the chair of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. Mike Ackerman in UK. Mike is professor at University College in London. Gam Shimre in Thailand. Gam is the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous People Pact. Bernardo Strasbourg in Brazil. Bernardo is the Executive Director of the International Institute for Sustainability. Priya Shamsundar in the US. Priya is the lead economist of the Nature Conservancy. And James Cairo in Kenya. James is the chief scientist of the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Institute. During the next 45 minutes, our panelists will walk you through the Science Task Force key messages to establish and implement high-quality ecosystem restoration and put forward crucial consideration to ensure that the decade delivers its promise. Then I will facilitate the engagement with you, the audience, in an interactive Q&A format. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, here is your chance to ask hard questions about ecosystem restoration and what the science behind this decade is all about. I encourage you to ask your question on the YouTube channels in English, French, and Spanish, and we will address this question during the event or afterwards if constrained by time. Now, let's move to the presentation. And at the outset, I would like to, for the sake of setting the scene, invite Angela to help us understand what is ecosystem restoration. Angela, what is ecosystem restoration and why does it matter? How individual, group, and sectors contribute to effective ecosystem restoration action? Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Look, Ecosystem restoration constitutes actions to prevent and halt ecosystem degradation, as well as reversing the loss of ecosystem integrity and preventing ecosystem collapse and species extinction, while acting to enhance the ecosystem functions and processes with mechanisms that maintain the restored ecosystem functionality over time and space. Ecosystem restoration can be implemented in different ecosystem types with different levels of transformation, including working and urban ecosystems. So why does it matter? Ecosystem degradation threatens development and survival of humankind. The restoration is challenging but possible. System-wide transformation involves collective action to managing ecosystems, landscapes, and seascapes as complex socio-environmental networks with highly interrelated and intergenerational components. How individuals, groups, and sectors contribute to effective restoration actions? Different types of social agents, motivated by different needs, can contribute to the restoration supply chain. Strategies need to talk to each of them as part of a socio-environmental system. Local community and landscape stakeholders will need to be at the center of restoration movements, as they often both have the local knowledge for and the motivation to proceed or block restoration if it does not benefit them. Partnerships and platforms can speed up the process of scaling up restoration. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much. Mike, could you advise about effective restoration needs, how these need to identify whom the benefit of restoration accrue for? Mike?
Indeed. Thank you, Luke. Yes, ecosystem benefits occur at different spatial scales, ranging from local supplies of water, food, and medicines up to global scale control of our climate. These benefits tend to be very long lasting, and therefore they maintain the opportunities for future generations and therefore are sustainable. But of course, we don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes there are trade-offs. For example, planting trees in one place can reduce flood risk, reduce sediment, but the same trees might also alter water supplies in a different area. So ecosystems take many forms. Some of them are natural wilderness areas, others are agricultural lands and urban zones. Together they form an interacting mosaic in the landscape. Water, sediments, and pollution and wildlife all move through that landscape. So understanding connectivity between the ecosystems is extremely important. And local ecosystem restoration needs to fit into the larger scale, such as the river basin scale or landscapes. We really need to think globally when we act locally. Now, unfortunately, in the past, there's often been quite antagonistic debate between nature-based solutions and engineering approaches, suggesting that it's really a choice between one or the other. However, some of the best solutions are actually a combination of the two. For example, dams have been managed to release environmental flows that can restore downstream ecosystems. Another good example is where a natural floodplain wetland has been engineered, creating embankments that actually increases the natural flood storage capacity and thus therefore further reduces flood risk downstream. I think by working together, engineers and ecologists can provide optimum solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Well, Gam, Mike has made reference to the well-known mantra, think globally and act locally, and that ecosystem restoration requires combination of solutions. What are the key enabling conditions and how do they tip the balance towards ecosystem restoration? Gam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luke, and greetings to all of you. First and foremost is that local and community institutions and organizations are where the need for restoration action originates and where the capacity motivation and local knowledge for effective restoration actions reside. Therefore, communities and villages need to become empowered through legitimate recognition as land stewards, property owners, and local decision makers. This also means that the multiple benefits of restoration to specific beneficiaries need to be traced and create mechanisms to meet and match needs at varying scales and connect the local with the global for engagement with the mainstream society. Second is that ecosystem restoration needs to be on the social agenda. System-wide transformation for restoration action requires collective action of the people. Because transforming ambitious pledges to action relies on institutional transformations at national scale across multiple political and regulatory levels, so that restoration becomes a national aspiration, that it is translated into action plans and restoration actions on the ground, supporting positive social change. The last point I would like to stress is that the importance of indigenous and local knowledge and the perception and our response to the local needs. We must recognize that critical agents of change of restoration are those who have rights over the land, territories, and resources, or are customarily managing the areas to be restored. These are indigenous peoples and local communities who need to gain rights. And because of their attachment to their lands, they possess invaluable time-tested ecological knowledge that can guide the restoration actions as stewards. So participating in local initiatives and supporting the stewardship and culturally relevant needs are key for long-term support and giving permanence to restoration. It is important that indigenous peoples and local communities are empowered from their work and from this initiative. Thank you very much, Luke.
Thank you, Gam. Thank you. We must not forget that the true agent of change are indigenous people and local communities, as Kim has said. But Bernardo, ecosystem restoration, we don't mean that it is a silver bullet, and it often comes with some challenging trade-off to grapple with. Why to achieve effective ecosystem restoration planning must be participatory, inclusive, and balanced, priorities and trade-off generated by the specific stakeholders' needs. Why is it that? Bernardo?
Thank you, Luke. And indeed, restoration can provide multiple benefits for people and the rest of nature. In fact, the International Resource Panel, the United Nations, has shown that restoration can contribute to all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Not all restoration benefits can be maximized simultaneously, though, and critical trade-offs between different ecological and social objectives and outcomes may emerge in a restoration program. It is crucial, therefore, to develop a shared understanding of the need to restore and the benefits and costs that each group might obtain from it over time, in order to motivate people, mobilize resources, maximize benefits, and minimize potential negative outcomes. Spatial planning helps to strike the right balance. For effective restoration, planning must be participatory, inclusive, and balance priorities and trade-offs generated by the specific stakeholder needs. To ensure the success of any restoration action, it is crucial that all perspectives are well understood and accounted for in a spatially explicit manner. Restoration always happens locally and in places, and research has shown that the benefits of restoration and their costs vary tremendously across space. And so does, of course, people's needs. And it's because of this combination that spatial planning might help to seize the synergies we can find and also avoid negative trade-offs.
Some stakeholders receive benefits from restoration, whereas others might experience burdens, in particular when restoration is not properly planned. Special restoration planning approaches support strategic decision-making and increase the likelihood that restoration achieves benefits and outcomes in a cost-effective, fair, and sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you very much. But we need finance for that. And finance and market infrastructure is critical for scaling up and sustaining ecosystem restoration. So Priya, to be effective in leveraging finance, why is it necessary to expand the focus solely on financial returns to consider financial, environmental, and social benefit in combination? Why is it that, Priya, please? Priya?
Yes, indeed, Luke. We certainly need to be able to finance restoration at scale if we want to be successful in this decade. What is clear is that the investments needed to meet restoration targets currently far exceed available public resources. There are various estimates out there, but at least one estimate suggests that the funding gap for restoration and conservation is at about $300 billion per year. So this is huge. What is also clear, therefore, is that we need a combination of public and private capital flows for restoration to scale. Now, we already do have a wide variety of public and private sustainable finance instruments which try to meet the goals that you just identified, Luke, and that can support restoration. These include financing instruments that supply capital, so equity and debt instruments, including green bonds. They also include risk mitigation instruments, insurance, for instance. However, right now, these sustainable financing instruments are a niche market. They are a niche offering within large financial institutions. So the scale of the use of sustainable finance needs to grow tremendously. Now, financial institutions are quite adept already in the use of environment and social risk management that can be used. These tools can be used for decision-making related to restoration, but industry norms need to be strengthened so the tools are fully integrated into decision-making. Finally, I want to say, particularly related to local stakeholders, because they are critical to our effort, is that they can be mobilized for restoration through jobs, through business opportunities, and sustainable supply chains. There are jobs in the restoration economy. We are seeing this right now in the growth in the renewable sector, and the same can happen with restoration. But we need new business models, and we most definitely need technical capacity. And these jobs will not just be tied to local economies, but to sustainable supply chains. So we need to strengthen these sustainable supply chains to harness global markets in order for these benefits to flow to local economies. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Priya. I like where you have landed. There are jobs in the ecosystem restoration economy, but we need new business model. Well, James, we all know this rather popular quote of Peter Drucker: if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Why are monitoring and adaptive management keys to effective and long-term restoration? James?
Thank you, Luke. And my colleagues have really mentioned already that effective ecosystem restoration actually require managing trade-offs. And we know very well that restoration takes time, and not all restoration benefits can be maximized simultaneously. So it's a really need that we understand and we move with all partners, understanding at what point will you harvest And I can give you an example of the coastal ecosystem, where if you are to restore areas that already have been degraded because of aquaculture, for instance, you need to play a trade-off. You need to understand the ecosystem change. And that brings me to the issues of long-term monitoring. Because for you to get back your key system, you need to monitor change. So monitoring and adaptive management is a key to effective and long-term restoration goals. And for that, we talked about the goal of ecosystem restoration should adapt over time. We are talking about in the age of the climate change. Some things change, some systems are very dynamic. The coastal ecosystem are very dynamic. So we should not be static, but we should be more dynamic, and we test, and we should have and we adapt with the changes coming. And to add on that, why most of the restoration fails is because of lack of baseline data. And what we are thinking there is, how do we effectively monitor and looking back at our baseline? So there's effective monitoring and evaluation require baseline data. And this can be long-term ecosystem experiment, we say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. Now is the time to move to Q&A. And for the Q&A session, panelists will first address the video recorded question we have received from representatives of different constituencies of ecosystem restoration. Afterwards, we will move to the question received via the live chat. So now let us listen to the question we have received.
I am Russell Jucarisa, young farmer of Golden Parauma Agriculture Cooperative. What are the key conditions that will enable family farmers to be agents of the change for the restoration of our planet?
Good morning, good afternoon. This is Julie Renaud from Nestlé Nespresso in Switzerland. So my question to you is, what do you think are the most immediate strategies that the private sector, either producing consumer good or finance side, can undertake to accelerate the transformational change that are highly needed? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Prowse. I serve on the 1T.org Trillion Trees platform at the World Economic Forum. Now, we all know that young people and future generations will be the most impacted by the climate crisis and accelerating loss of biodiversity. Young people will also stand to benefit the most from a restoration economy. So my question is, how can we improve incentive structures in the public and private sector to increase youth-led solutions and youth ecopreneurship for ecosystem restoration? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Robin Seethal, and I'm the founder and principal consultant at ICTAR Sustainability. I'm also the co-chair of the Climate and Environment Steering Committee for the Global Shapers community. When I think of what it means to develop high-quality ecosystem restoration initiatives, I think being mindful of how we choose to develop and lead these solutions is just as critical for the long-term success of high-quality ecosystem restoration initiatives as the initiative itself. Therefore, it's important we reflect on the internal drivers behind these solutions to shift them from egocentric drivers such as lack, fear, and division to ecocentric drivers such as abundance, love, and unity. Or in other words, there is a deep-rooted need to shift our leadership from egocentric leadership to ecocentric leadership. My question then is, how do we cultivate solutions in ecocentric intentions and leadership?
Thank you. Here we have four questions, and I doubt not that our panelists will address them in depth. The first question comes from a farmer, a young farmer, Russell Deokaritsa, young farmer, and his question is, what are the key conditions that will enable family farmers to be the agent of the change for the restoration of our planet? I will put that question before Gam and James. Gam?
Thank you, Luke. I think that's a very important question. I would say that the first point is that we must recognize the legitimate claims of family farmers to their lands, territories, and resources in compliance with international human rights standards. Second is that invest in enabling family farmers to develop resilient livelihoods, because by very nature, agricultural production relies on interaction with natural processes involving the climate and environment, making family farmers a key group in adapting to already inevitable consequences of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation. This also means that they are made the agents of change in addressing the drivers of these mounting challenges with necessary support that is culturally relevant. The third is support local markets, including informal markets, and provide capacity building and finance mechanisms in collaboration with local authorities and the private sector to fund necessary infrastructures and services to the community institutions and organizations. I think the other important point is to increase investment and promote institutional reform to meet emerging needs and develop programs to understand farmers' demands and facilitate co-creation of innovative practices and knowledge, and also technologies to develop dynamism of family farming, especially to provide incentives to the youth. Finally, of course, the farmers must be involved in policy-making processes, guiding the governments and policymakers and so on. Thank you, Luke.
Well, thank you, Gam. Yes, James?
Okay. Thank you. I think my colleague has almost said everything, but I retaliate that the family farmers basically means small-scale farmers who operate throughout the world. And I'll be talking in the context of Africa, and I'm asking, how can the small-scale farmer in Africa be an agent of ecosystem restoration? First of all, I want to look at the connection, the nexus between agriculture and environment. You need good environment to sustain agriculture. We also need to practice sustainable agricultural practices, the rotation of crop rotation, diversification, agroforestry, and picking the right crops at the right time. That may sound so much for the farmer, but ideally, it's a small-scale farmer that doesn't ruin the environment. And the farmer needs also to access financial resources and also move to technology. And technology, I'm not talking about big trucks, but I'm talking about how does he even practice ecological restoration in his own field, such that he's talking about, and now we are talking about sustainable agriculture or smart agriculture. We have to also, lastly, we need to think about improved gender equity and empowerment in managing our family farms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. Well, next is the question we have received from Julie Renaud, who is the Sustainability Strategy Manager at Nespresso. Her question is, and I will put that question before you, Priya, what do you think are the most immediate strategies that the private sector, the producing, consumer good or finance side can undertake to accelerate the transformational change that is highly needed? Priya, that is for you.
Thank you, Luke. Let's think about two aspects of the private sector, a set of institutions in the private sector. First, focusing on financial institutions, pension funds, insurance providers, mutual funds, and so on. As I said, the focus on environment risk management tools and their integration into their investment decisions has to increase and scale significantly. It's happening, but not at the scale that is required for restoration and other conservation-related activities. They can undertake positive or negative screening of their capital investments. This is the first thing that they can institute carefully across the board so that investment decisions actually support restoration through the screening tools that they use. They can also undertake environment social governance engagement. We've just had a recent example with a huge natural and gas company, Exxon, that has showed that capital investors can really change corporate governance structures. So this is another very important role that financial institutions can undertake in order to move the flow of resources towards restoration. The private sector can ensure sustainable supply chains. They have to do a number of things for this to scale as well. Many are trying, so you have to give them credit. But they have to build their own technical capacity in environmental and social governance and create new business models for restoration. Cannot emphasize this enough. We need new business models. They have to develop and implement monitoring and evaluation processes so that there is traceability across their supply chains. They can track this, as James has identified. This is important for restoration. They have to join hands amongst each other, amongst their peers. So there's an industry norm that is set. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Priya. Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question. I would like to second Julie Renaud's question. And that follow-up question will be for you, Bernardo. What is needed to develop a fungible market for nature-based climate solutions and ecosystem services and allow for businesses to integrate ecosystem restoration into their business model? Bernardo?
Thank you, Luke. There are massive synergies, but potential trade-offs between climate-focused, nature-based solutions and other ecosystem services, including biodiversity conservation. And therefore, it's extremely important to indeed consider them jointly from the start when planning interventions. As an example of synergies, more biodiversity ecosystems tend to be more resilient to climate change impact, therefore increasing the permanency of the sequestered carbon. On the other hand, simplistic tree planting initiatives, in particular outside forest ecosystems, can harm biodiversity. Improving restoration-related knowledge, data, standards, financial instruments, and decision support tools are some of the crucial elements to support businesses in integrating these considerations in their business models. Equally important, though, is a realignment of the incentives businesses receive, be it from governmental regulation, tax regimes, and so on, or be it from all of us as consumers. Rewarding those who move in the right direction while penalizing the ones that don't might provide very powerful incentives to speed up the integration of these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. We must realign incentives. And that may give me a transition to Lindsay Prowse's question. And her question is, how can we, and I will put that question before Angela and James, how can we improve incentives structures in the public and private sector, i.e. tax incentive, intergenerational learning, etc., to increase youth-led solution and youth eco-entrepreneurship for ecosystem restoration?
Thank you, Luke. I would say that in parallel or to start with developing incentives, you first need to youth interested by the topic. And this means that they have to be educated and informed about the issue. Then they need to be aware of opportunities as well as how they can become ecopreneurs. We have examples, for example, the case of youth innovation camps on the topic developed in Ontario, and the Kids Can Innovation Camp. This would be a great step to have some of these camps and places to encourage innovation related to restoration. We also have experiences in developing countries, like in my case in Colombia, related to adaptation projects in high mountain ecosystems where participatory ecological restoration experiences have been promoted in the communities through local schools involving children, youth, and parents. And the young participants have not only received benefits, but have also been interested in following technical studies associated with rural development issues in which restoration is a central topic. It would be good if governments can also start encouraging these types of initiatives in school through special programs, awards, or even startup funding. These actions that arise with seed funds from GF projects, partner organizations from the government and communities must be scaled up with the organizations of the public and private sectors. So in summary, I would say, first, you need communication, then education, and finally, engagement and innovation programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Communication, education, engagement. James, what else? James?
Yes,
James?
I'm there. What we'll need as incentives to the public and the private sector to increase youth-led solutions and entrepreneurship. I had a line of that because I was looking at how do we support our private and public sector. What we need is issues of tax. What we need is both financials and non-financials. And on financials, I'm talking about the tax exemptions, for instance. I'm talking about subsidies, and not all subsidies, because some subsidies are not good. Like when you do fish subsidies, it can lead to overfishing. So, but you need subsidies so that the private sector can be able to attract the youth in the restoration action. We need to provide low interest loans, green loans, and eco-labeling, certification. And also, there was issues of financing. How do we bring in sustainable financing? We can promote PES scheme, payment for ecosystem services. And this one I'm talking about the red scheme, for instance. For non-financials, we can have permits. We can give those who are practicing good, the one who are good player, we give them poor. We have seen this one working even in our African setting. One of the community in my society, they have been given 10 rights to protect a certain mangrove area for carbon offset. And it's working so well, so they are protecting that part of the forest. And lastly, as my colleague talked about, increased education. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. And then for the fourth question, I will submit the question of Robin Sittle to the wisdom of Mike and Dam, because that one is quite deep. Robin recalled that egocentric leadership is at the root of our environmental crisis, and she asked them, how do we cultivate solutions in egocentric intentions and leadership? Mike?
Yes, thank you, Luke. I agree with the questioner that it's a very important challenge as to how do we get leaders to embrace ecosystem restoration. I think it's important to recognize that leaders have a range of backgrounds and experience. It's often in subjects such as economics, law, and politics. It's rarely in ecology. So we've got to consider how they think and what drives them, not about us as ecologists or related subjects. It's unrealistic, I think, to expect these leaders to drop all of their experience and concepts and frameworks and suddenly embrace a new idea called ecosystem approach. Instead, What we need to do is to show them how ecosystems can fit into their world and help them deliver their goals and expectations and see it from their point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. And Gam?
Thank you. I think this is a very interesting question, also an incredibly challenging one. So allow me to just put a reference point to answer this question. The CBD, the vision of the Convention on Biological Diversity is living in harmony with nature by 2050. A vision of a kind that is not going to be achieved by decisions influenced by lifestyle choices or laws and programs determining lifestyle choices. It is a call to elevate human well-being to a higher level, that is society living in harmony with nature. Such a call needs motivational force that is driven from deep within, that is shaped by a range of human emotions. That begins from an attachment such as our positive attachments within our homes, the family, the neighbors, and the community, and our attachments to the rivers, forests, mountains, and waters, and all the living beings within. Attachments that have crystallized into spontaneous reciprocal relationship within societies and with nature. A leader will have to necessarily act with such motivational force and engage in sharing of cultural values and good practices to nurture and embody reciprocal relationships and obligations that unites the past, present, and future, which means extending our obligations and responsibilities not just to the present and humans, but to the past and future, and also to our surrounding nature. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Gam. As I have one question from you from the chat, the live chat. Gam, the question is, what can be done if the indigenous people are dubious or not so willing to implement restoration projects? Gam?
I think the first thing is, what do we see in the struggles and demands of indigenous peoples? If we are objectively understanding and examining those issues and demands, I think we begin to start to have some kind of a dialogue point. And precisely that's the point that I'm raising, that we need to recognize them. One is that they have rights, and they have, therefore, that is one of the biggest incentives in terms of how they become the agents. I think dialogue point is always possible, and there are reasons why there are such resistance, and there can be why they will not be cooperative. These are, of course, a range of historical reasons and experiences, and there is a huge trust deficits. So how do we build that? That is something, an area that we really need to examine and approach accordingly. Luke, thank you.
Thank you, Gam. Another question. Unfortunately, we won't be able to, to take them all. We will follow up, after the end of this session. But there's one more question I will put before you, Priya. Restoration is expensive. Who must pay for it? What are the best sustainable financial instruments? Priya?
Yes, to try and quickly answer that, Luke, I think there are a couple of different ways to think about this. One is restoration can increase private goods and services, timber, fish, tree products, what have you. And if we can create the system so that timber, for instance, is not obtained from degrading natural forests and instead obtained from managed forests, then the supply chains themselves will pay for the restoration. So degraded land is used for creating these goods and services that can be of private use. So markets will be able to pay for those and for the jobs that they create. But there are certain services that restoration offers which are in the public realm. Flood mitigation services from restoration, for instance. And here you need the public sector to pay for it. There's no other real option, and the public sector will need to pick up the onus of the investments. But there are also other services like carbon, for instance, and there is a growing market for forest carbon, again, to give you an example, and where you can bring in the private sector to finance the development of forest carbon, but not, as Bernardo earlier said, by reducing the biodiversity potential of restoration. So we have options. There is not a silver bullet or a best solution, but the idea is to try and use as many different options as we can and create the systems, the enabling conditions to make those options grow.
Thank you, Priya. Well, I wish we have more time for the series of questions we are receiving from the chat box. But ladies and gentlemen, my closing remark will be a recap of the headlines of the Science Task Force 5 key messages that have been conveyed to you by our panelists. Effective restoration action need to identify how, when, and to whom the benefit of restoration accrue. The second key message is key enabling conditions tip the balance toward restoration. And the third one is for effective ecosystem restoration, planning must be participatory, inclusive, and balanced priorities and trade-offs generated by the specific stakeholders' needs. And four, to leverage increased finance, it is necessary to expand the focus solely on financial returns to consider financial, environmental, and social benefit in combination. And the last one, not the least, monitoring and adaptive management are keys to effective and long-term restoration. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we should not really forget that we humans are part of nature, and thus we need to create a balanced relationship with the ecosystem that sustains us. So I invite you as change makers to join the hashtag Generation Restoration movement and shape this decade and beyond by transforming our planet through the restoration of its degraded ecosystem. So, dear participants, we have now come to the end of this event. Please join me in thanking our speakers. And most of all, a big thank to you all for your present engagement, and as well as the next one by joining the Generation Ecosystem Restoration Movement. Thank you very much, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.